It is definitely a fitting time to have our weekly review, our weekly recap of the situation in the raid when it comes to the performance and the popularity of specs, given that Blizzard just announced the weekly reset set of nerfs to both One-Arm Bandit and Maxi. It's been a bit over a week since the last time we looked at the changes in the raid. That was right after the first set of balance tuning for the season. We were trying to see if any of these sets of changes were particularly impacting the specs being buffed or the specs being nerfed. And now we have had another week worth of data. This was the last week that we checked. The first thing we noticed is that the recently nerfed Fire Mage had dropped a few positions compared to their rank 1 of before the nerfs, and that a few of the buffed specs like survival and like marksmanship saw their position improve over time. Even assassination was buffed in the last balance tuning. Some of the other specs being buffed, like for example balanced druid, didn't actually see that much of an improvement. We also had the freshly buffed Devastation Evoker by almost 5%, increasing in their performance. So now it's been more than over a week compared to what we see here, and these are now the results. Now, one of the new news of these results is that the Devastation Evoker has gone even higher than before, but more importantly, Frost Death Knight now is suddenly breaking into the top 6. They went from being the 18th DPS before the buffs. After the first week of buffs, they were the 10th DPS, and now 1 week later, they are the 6th DPS so far in the raid. Shadow Priest also, after the buffs, has increased now to being middle of the pack compared to being towards the bottom, hand in hand with the other buffed spec balance. Now looks like even after 1 more week worth of data of the post tuning, it hasn't really changed the state of Balance Druid in the raid, as it continues to be at the bottom, right alongside Arcane Mage, BM Hunter, and even doing worse, Demonology Warlock. We can also see in case of some differences, because you might be saying, well, some of these specs are harder to play. It's more difficult to have very good logs on the larger player base when you look at all of the percentiles of these logs. So what if we look at just the 95 percentile of logs? So only the top logs. Presumably someone who gets a 95 percentile log isn't the one that had to do the balls on sticks, bug junker. Most definitely it wasn't the hunters having to deal with the coins in the back when you were playing One-Arm Bandit. It probably wasn't the mage or maybe even the hunter having to run around to do the toys on Cauldron, so only the actual good results in here. And it's comforting to see that the trend between the everyday player and the top result is very similar, because in terms of top results you see Unholy, Affliction, Dev, Fire, Marksmanship, Windwalker, Assassination, and Shadow Priest. When you look at here, you have Affliction, Unholy, Assassination, Devastation, Windwalker, Frost, Fire. The only one slightly out is Shadow. Shadow is the one that shows to have a much higher improvement when looking at their top logs. The other are where they already are in terms of rankings, like top 8 basically, except for Shadow, which increases by quite a bit compared to their overall results. The one who actually that doesn't increase that much when looking at their top logs, in fact they lose a bit when looking at their top logs, is Frost DK. Frost DK, which loses out quite a bit when looking at the better performers overall in the top logs of these results. Now, once again, as we look at these results week by week, we have to see, okay, the effects that, for example, nerfs might have had or buffs might have had in the last tuning, possibly even the increase in item level, getting closer to your favorite, best in slot setup of stats, possibly favoring some specs more than others, maybe some specs getting more and more haste or getting more and more mastery, get to perform better over other specs that don't really scale nearly as hard with secondary stats. However, what also is going to play a role in these overall results is the amount of bosses that are killed in progression, because obviously these results are only based on the bosses being killed and bosses being logged. So for example, right now, Galdiwix has a grand total of how many would this be? Like maybe 5 guilds, maybe 6 guilds logging this fight, and then you have, for example, Rick Reaver, which has, I don't know, some several hundreds of guilds worth of logs. So obviously these results will be much more reliable, of course, and will pay more overall in the overall results than the few logs you have on Galliwix or even the few logs you have here on Magzi, for example. But the more you have, of course, the more logs you have, the more of an impact they will have in the overall results. Last week we were talking about having more and more logs of Sprocket. Now we have even more logs on Unarmed Bandit. Now this is no longer just, 5 or 10 guilds. This starts to get into the several dozens worth of guilds when it comes to logs. What is perhaps more interesting is that while you already had some specs already known to be doing very well on this fight, because as you have followed the Race to World First, you will have seen, for example, the guilds stacking Shadow Priests and the guilds stacking Affliction Warlocks because of their spread cleave damage they were able to do, and you see them doing well. You also see Fire Mage, which can also spread their Ignite to do damage. You can also see the Devastation Evoker, which can have extra value because their Mastery does more damage to full or high HP targets. So of course, whenever there is a new add, they can gain more value from their Mastery. And playing Scale Commander, they have the 2 or 3 target cleave Disintegrate, which is quite good for the targeting on this boss. Those were known quantities already, doing well on Unarmed Bandit. What is more surprising perhaps is not even just Frost DK, because Frost DK, if you look at the parses, okay, there is like 5 of them doing well. What is more relevant is Unholy, where you have more than 100 on the logs and being clearly first in the overall damage on this fight. It is an interesting damage profile since, as you can see, it is the first, because discounting the very few logs of Frost DK is practically the only melee spec doing this well compared to the sea of range DPS you have after them. In Unarmed Bandit you see Affliction, Frost, Devastation, Fire Mage, you have Shadow Priest, and then you have to go down to Windwalker on like 9th place to see the next melee over the performance of Unholy in this fight compared to all the other casters. It is quite different than what we have already talked about and shown in Mythic Plus about the value of Unholy getting tons of damage in Mythic Plus because of their Blood Beast. Obviously, in this fight, with such fewer targets, the value of the Blood is Life explosion isn't the 7 million DPS you have in big pools in Mythic Plus. It's much less relevant in here. This fight for Unholy truly allows you to, supercharge your death call with the damage profile you have. This is a Unarmed Bandit where the DK is doing 3.8 million DPS with a 2.5 million average damage of death call compared to the number 2 log of Lock and Stock where you're only doing 2.5 million DPS and 1.7 million damage on your death call. This is due to obviously the 10% damage buff from the coins you get on Unarmed Bandit, but also due to the amount of execute time you have available in this fight, both from the adds that you have to swap to whenever they drop below their execute threshold. You gain massive value from reaping. It definitely shows with this damage profile having Unholy do very well, so it's understandable to see the all results overall having Unholy be towards the top results with more and more logs of Unarmed Bandit. We have, of course, even more logs of Sprocket. Now we are in the several hundreds logs worth of DPS, and we have a double Hunter pack at the top. In fact, for the first time in what looks like forever, we have 3 Hunter specs in the top 6 of results on Sprocket. Yes, of course, in terms of popularity, you have Survival with only 11 logs, and it's not that Marksmanship is that high up either. However, even with those few logs, you still see them doing extremely well in single target, because that's what Sprocket is. In fact, across the entire raid, Sprocket Monger Lock and Stock is the only fight to have only 1 target. Literally, the only fight. Well, you can guarantee all of this damage will be the average power of these specs exclusively in a single target. This perhaps is useful to show the weaknesses of these specs in reverse, right? Because once you remove single target only power, the hunters that were previously at the top are now middle of the pack. And then again, if you take the average and just look at the damage to bosses across all bosses, the 2 hunter specs go back up again. Obviously, the damage to bosses is much different than looking at a pure single target boss, because the damage to bosses in AoE or cleave fights can be heavily affected by things like funnel, by things like specs gaining more value from being able to hit other targets to do more damage on single target, like for example One-Armed Bandit and cleave. Things like multi-dotting the adds that spawn, rather than just doing damage only to the boss, like in here. Once you switch to the actual overall damage on Bandit, you will see all of the specs gaining more value from that type of damage profile. We don't really have enough to see yet any, meaningful results for Magzi, because the logs are just too few. There's just not enough specs currently having their public logs for Magzi. You can guess, of course, given what we have seen from previous bosses, who will be doing well on this fight. So it's a mostly single target fight with perhaps a few adds you can cleave to every once in a while. So we have already seen these two specs doing well in pure single target. Even Unholy DK, you have of course Destruction, being able to two-target cleaving, for example the choppers when they spawn, especially when they stay far away from the boss, making it harder for the melees to actually cleave on them and much easier for a spec like Destruction. That's what we have so far in terms of overall results, both from a normie average result perspective as well as from a 95 percentile, top results level of perspective in the raid so far. At this point there are a few outliers. Honestly, as someone completely out of this argument talking about DPS power, I don't really care about that. If I were to look at nerfs, for example, I wouldn't actually see any spec at the moment deserving of any nerfs if we are talking about the raid. Yes, my default stance on Fire Mage is that it should be nerfed anytime, any moment, any patch notes, it should be nerfed. But besides that, none of the DPS specs right now look, particularly nerfable in terms of power level. When it comes to buffs, on the other hand, then, yes, just like Fire Mage at the top, we have the same argument for Augmentation at the bottom. Augmentation should not be buffed whatsoever, but Demo, as well as Arcane, are the prime targets for buffs purely based on results. Yes, it's also true that the performance level of those specs is also heavily impacted by the caliber, by the value of players playing these specs, right? If you have 36,000 mages playing Fire and only 1,500 playing Arcane, chances are most of the top players in very high level guilds, etc., will be playing Fire. So technically speaking, if we moved all of these top players to Arcane, just that would be enough to slightly increase their overall performance, but possibly even more than that would be needed for the spec. Other specs currently being low are in a bit of a harder pickle, because these specs are being, not nearly as high while being powerful elsewhere. For example, it's nice to see in terms of top results, specs like Balance or Elemental or even Ret and Subtlety doing quite poorly in overall results while still being very powerful in Mythic Plus. Their AoE damage, their burst AoE, their value in Mythic Plus is very high. So now you are at a moment where you're asking, is it actually necessary to even buff them in the raid, considering how well, for example, a spec like Balance is doing in Mythic Plus? Well, once again, someone would point out at Fire and say, why can't they be meta in both, but they can't, for example? That could be a good argument to make, but to be fair, I wouldn't even, worry too much about those specs being weak, given how much power they have elsewhere at the moment. Now, besides the changes and the fluctuations in the DPS performance, we of course also have the, well, supposedly changes when it comes to the raid in terms of healers, because healers also got changes, and actually in terms of sheer numbers, the healers got larger buffs than the buffs given to the DPS. We were talking about last week when we were looking at the weak ones at the bottom, the specs in need of buffs being Holy Paladin, Holy Priest and Preservation Evoker, which were the three specs being buffed. And then of course the two nerfs going to Mistweaver and Discipline, also very expected. Now, again, the situation is very, very even for the specs from 2nd to 5th place. Yes, the color order has changed. Now suddenly we have Preservation Evoker 2nd, but as you can see, the average results are practically indistinguishable. There is between 2.471 average million HPS of Resto Druid and the 2.495 of Preservation Evoker. It's a 24,000 HPS difference. It's a 1%. The difference in the average healing between here and here is 1%. Technically, if you add Holy Paladin with 2.5 million, is again even closer in between second and sixth. There's only a 1.2% across all of these healers, meaning that day by day, any second really, any of these colors can be swapped around because of the small difference between top and bottom. Obviously, you have the outliers. It's nice and tidy that the outliers are wrapping up all the different colors, the white at the top and the white at the bottom. Now you have Holy Priest being about 115,000 HPS below Holy Paladin, and then you have the Discipline Priest being about 100,000 HPS, 120,000 HPS above this clump of healers. So we're talking about Holy Priest being 5% weaker than this group, and this group being 5% weaker than Discipline. So that's it, we have solved the problem. Nerf Disc by 5%, buff Holy by 5%, and now you have perfect parity. Even by looking at top results, so again, now in the raid we are looking at the top 95 percentile, the better results of healers. The gap is possibly even closer amongst this bunch. For Holy Priest, it's only like 120-ish thousand from these, and about 160,000 from these, and then the gap here is 300,000 HPS, so a flat 10% gap if you look at the very top results. Now, one of the possible diminishing returns, of course, though, is that other specs suffer less from having multiple specs in the same group than Discipline. It might be something to wonder about, like, okay, I keep seeing Discipline Priest here, but in the end, when you look at the parses, Discipline is here. Discipline is getting destroyed by both Mistweaver and Resto Shaman, and they are practically very close to Resto Druid. So why? Discipline is here, it's OP, it's broken. Why aren't there nearly as many Discipline Priests being played? Well, Discipline does have severe diminishing returns in playing with other Discipline Priests in a group. For a second, before the release of this tier, there was the thought, even amongst World First Guilds, to play Discipline even more than just one, to stack a Discipline Priest, because this could stack. Once this was nerfed not to stack amongst multiple Discipline Priests in your raid, and now, even in the latest set of nerfs, the damage reduction was reduced from 3 to 2%. The value of having multiple Discipline Priests in your raid has gone down by quite a lot, because the style of healing of Discipline Priest, this is a Gallywix log. The style is very unique. Right, you look at these three monks, right? They have similar peaks of healing, and then you look at Disc. When you have multiples of these in your group, it makes it harder for the Discipline Priest to gain value. If you want to slot, for example, two different Discipline Priests wanting to do this, it's easier to instead just bring these kind of healing profiles, which are still with good peaks, but they have higher overall continuous throughput even outside of their cooldowns compared to Discipline. So it's easier to slot, multiple of other specs practically in most of the other fights compared to being able to slot multiple Discipline Priests, because their healing profile is much more extreme compared to something like a Monk or even something like a Resto Druid. So even in their powered up state they have now, you will likely still continue to see only one at best in terms of numbers in the raid, compared to these specs where you can see multiples of. The only exception, of course, is to the poor Preservation Evoker, which kind of works like Discipline, and that's kind of why it is the by far least played, because it wants to do the same things a Discipline Priest is going to do, which is the big spike of healing on a 90-second cooldown thanks to Stasis. In the case of Discipline is thanks to Evangelism and their 2 charges of Premonition. In the case of Preservation Evoker is their Stasis. This would be a perfect example. Pretty bad to have both Disc and Preservation Evoker in the same group, because finding places where both ramp this high is very difficult, because they would just steal each other's HPS, and it's not that Styx has any other room to require this kind of ramp besides its electromagnetic sorting. So for healers, it's good that now we have much closer results across all of these healers. Yes, we still have some help needed on Holy Priest and some nerfs needed for Discipline Priest. Funny, because that's just what we talked about, the possible nerfs needed for Discipline in Mythic Plus, for a completely different reason. The reason for Discipline Priest to be nerfed in Mythic Plus is because of the stack of talents buffing your power ward shield, giving you some full HP worth value of absorb shields on a 6-second cooldown, being far too powerful right now. However, it seems a pretty straightforward situation right now for healers. The ones in the middle are okay, the ones at the edges are not. That's what we have for healers after this week, I believe 4? Is this the end? No, this is the week 5. This is week 5, I think, of the raid. 2 weeks into the tuning that happened a couple of weeks ago. These were the results so far in the raid, most of which being quite reliable and large enough to make a case up to Sprocket, and nowadays even somewhat into One-Armed Bandit. That's what we have as per average performance of the DPS specs as well as healer specs. So for today though, on this Tuesday, on the eve, I guess, of yet another reset week with, surprisingly again, 0 balance tuning, it is now time to leave each other. We're starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, it's always a bit confusing when you wake up, there is the sun out, you see all of the flowers blooming, and then you go out and it's actually cold.